quick question. Raise of hands, how many of you are familiar with NISO and understand what we are and do? About half. Okay. Very quickly, we are a standards organization that develops technical standards for publishers, libraries, and software providers. So we work with those three communities to develop things like ISBN numbers and MARC records systems. And one of the things that we are working on right now is a joint project with the International Association of STM Publishers called RA21. RA21 is an interesting name. In a quick Google search, we were able to find only one other thing that's called RA21. It's some tax form in Scandinavia. So it's not surprising you haven't heard of it. Maybe we need to do some rebranding or something. So a little bit of context, and I know most of you are probably familiar with this, deeply familiar with this, being here at an OpenAthens conference. We have been using, the library community and the publishing community have been using IP address-based authentication since the mid-90s or early 90s. And for those of you who might recall in the mid-90s, this is what an operating system used to look like. This was the day before Apple had actually figured out that there was color in the world. You can imagine that the life of most computer users has changed considerably. IP authentication worked really well for libraries when people were working in their dorms, working in their offices, working physically in a library. This computer has no Ethernet port. It has never been physically connected to any network ever. So IP authentication, which had worked really well in a particular software and hardware environment, doesn't work as well in an environment where people are logging into the internet via coffee shops or on airplanes, trains, even from their homes. And this is compounded by the fact that increasingly people are using mobile devices to log into the network. And these mobile devices might switch over from the Wi-Fi that's working in the room here. You might go over into another corner and realize that that Wi-Fi network isn't working as well. You as a user might not even notice that the device is switched over to a Wi-Fi signal. And the basis of your authentication completely fails because you are now using a cellular signal IP address, not the university's or the library's IP address network. And so authentication, which works on one side of the room, suddenly doesn't work on the other side of the room. And we have spent decades teaching users not to notice or care about authentication, and then suddenly this system fails. And what do the users want? They would like fairly simple, seamless access to content. Let me say that again. This is really important to users. They want to get content. They don't want to think about authentication. And in case you missed it, they really want seamless access to content. Now, okay, privacy, nice. Security, I guess, if I have to. Customization is fine. But really what users want in the context of library services is seamless access to content. And how do we create that? Now, single sign-on systems like OpenAthens have the promise of providing this seamless access. It has the promise of providing centralized management of identity information, a single user interface ideally, reducing IT calls and help desk requests. And it's been around for a long time. This is not new technology. OpenAthens was started in 1999. Shibboleth as a project was launched in 2000, so we're several decades in here. And this is also not the first time that we as a community have tried to develop improvements to the user interface and the user experience. In 2009, NISO launched a project called SSO in order to improve the user experience for single sign-on systems. 10 years later, I'm still talking about this. So Espresso wasn't nearly as successful as we'd hoped, although there was some adoption, considerable adoption within the publishing community to help build some common user experience. And yet, 10 years on, we lack a common language. We lack a common user interface. The user experience is disjointed. There are continuing problems with the where are you from experience. And there's also absolutely no understanding of what a common attribute release policy should be. What kind of information are we sharing about the users? So are users just getting annoyed? And they're moving on, and they're throwing up their hands and saying, oh, well, we need to approach things in a different way. And part of the problem has to do with the disjointed nature of the relationship between the institution, the library, and the institutional IT department. They're driven by different goals, different communities, and sometimes different values. And this is compounded by the fact, and this is some data from a study done by OhioLink consortium in the state of Ohio, where they asked if there was a dedicated person in the IT department who was dedicated to providing the library IT support. 80% of those institutions didn't have dedicated IT support. It's not surprising that the relationship between the library and the IT department isn't as robust as it could be. Part of what we're trying to do is build better relationships between the IT community and the library community, discussing values, discussing with the libraries what sort of issues the technology side has, and how do you speak with the IT departments and explain to the IT staff what the library systems need. And one big element of that is privacy. Privacy has been one of the core complaints with regard to RA21 because it's built around expectations of privacy. The library community has an ethical, and in some cases a legal, in certain jurisdictions, a legal requirement to protect patrons' privacy. So in that context, data gathering should be minimal. There should be informed consent from the user if possible. And the GDPR, which was put into force last year, has only compounded this awareness of privacy and driven that awareness of privacy into the corporate sector, the library, the publishing and software providers, who are now legally required to care, particularly in an EU context, but also in an American context where there is most likely going to be European citizens on campus. And one of the concerns here is the control issues about these concerns. How do you control the access to this information? And that is generally run through the proxy server systems that most institutions are using. And this is an article from Lisa Hinchliffe that was posted in the Scholarly Kitchen about controlling the proxy. There's a perception that RA21 is all about taking the proxy servers away from the library community, and the concern that that control is going to get passed to the IT departments. The IT departments don't have the same concerns about privacy or aren't as deeply aware of them or have the same values as the librarian community. So we control the server, we control the logs. We, the librarians, have ultimate control over it. And I know some librarians are so adamant about protecting patron privacy that they wipe their server logs on a daily basis, which I think is pretty robust. But it's important to note that the proxy server still contains the data. It still contains user information about what they're accessing. It's just held in-house if you have that proxy server in your library, which not every institution does. Most institutions have outsourced that in some cloud-based fashion. And there's also a lot of misunderstanding about SAML. SAML is the security assertion markup language that underpins these different single sign-on systems. And SAML was developed with a variety of use cases. One of those use cases is course management. And in that course management use case, you need to know who the user is. You need to know that Todd Carpenter is taking Psych 101. And because he's taking Psych 101, you need certain information about me in order to provide that course management service. Now, you don't have to share all of the attribute information that you have about a user. You don't have to share anything at all. And it's understanding the flexibility that's inherent in the SAML exchange that is lost in some of these conversations. And it's that flexibility that allows a SAML exchange to be virtually as anonymous as IP-based authentication, and therefore avoids most of the privacy questions and concerns that people have. Now, doubling down on this, and RA21 is absolutely focused on this issue in question of privacy, we've adopted the attribute and privacy recommendations published by Géant. It says refeds. It eventually became Géant, which is a identity federation, a kind of consortium of identity federations here in Europe. And that policy focuses on limitations to the attributes that are shared. And it focuses on if there is consent by the user, and this is in the recommendation, if there is consent by the user, you can provide additional information for personalization purposes, et cetera. But really, in order to provide single sign-on services, the base level is don't provide any information at all about the patron. Provide a pseudonymous ID and a token that says, this person is from this institution, let them in. It doesn't say anything else about who that user is, what their status is. There are opportunities by the institution to adjust that. So say if you wanted to track users by faculty versus students or some generic grouping, you can do so. But all of that is controlled by the institution. So there's been a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about RA21 and what we're trying to do. And I'm going to go through some of that criticism and kind of respond to it in some cases. So one of the primary criticisms of RA21 is that this is all a paranoid reflection of Sci-Hub, that there is this piracy going on, and the publishers are just unbelievably freaked out about this, so we have to change our authentication systems. Truth be told, that is part of the motivation to improve the security of access control systems. But actually, RA21 was started because of outreach from the library community. The corporate librarians who cannot use IP-based authentication needed the publishing community to move more in the direction of using single sign-on systems. So there was a kind of confluence of motivations here, but really this is about improving the user experience. This is about providing better services to the library users. Another concern is, well, open access is the solution here, right? We don't need better sign-on systems. What we need is open access to content. If all content was free and there was no authentication systems, well, that's great, right? The problem is, if every scientific journal article was open, there are still a variety of other library services that won't be. Monographs, ebook systems. There's no big movement for open access books. News services, I don't expect that the LexisNexis or a variety of other legal services are going to be free. There are also other services that libraries and institutions provide that are not, not necessarily paid for, but you do want to authenticate users for, say, computing resources, et cetera. So to think about journal subscriptions and journal content is the only and the greatest thing that libraries do is to take a really dim view of the broad nature of what libraries do for their users. And then a final criticism is that this is all just a nefarious plot by the publishing community to just hoover up all of the patron data that they could possibly get. And again, circle back to that refed's policy, privacy policy. The publishing community wants to improve access. Their business model is not advertising. Their business model is to provide content. They want to provide better services. They don't want to gather up all of this information. And so by adopting a SAML approach that is privacy protecting and limiting the attributes that should be shared, you're kind of avoiding this question. If that was really what the publishers want to do, they wouldn't have signed on to the privacy policies which we have done. So RA21 has some of this kind of, has to fight against some of this notion that IP authentication is the greatest thing ever, and we need to battle against that. Because we, over the last 25-ish years, 30 years, have developed a kind of comfort level with IP-based authentication. We're used to the problems. We're used to getting around it through proxy servers or VPNs, rather than addressing the problem and trying to solve that problem. Now, we understand that this is going to be a long process. It's going to be a dual stack solution for probably a decade or more, because institutions not every institution has the technical resources to move directly into a single sign-on environment. Maybe the Athens community is maybe a bit further ahead, but not every institution has the resources to do this. What we're trying to do, though, is to get a concentration around a single solution, not multiple approaches. There are a variety of entities in the community right now that are looking at improving the user experience. Some of them are just IP authentication in a different wrapper. So RA21 is built on adopted infrastructure. Institutions have decades of experience working with it, and it's demonstrably better than in IP-based authentication. So I've talked for a good 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I haven't told you what RA21 is, so maybe I should do that. So RA21 is fairly simple. It's got 4 main components. There is a default discovery service for identity providers, which is based on EduGain metadata. If a service provider has their own discovery service, that's fine. You don't have to use the default one we're developing. The second element of this is browser-based local storage of the user's identity provider preference. RA21 is not storing credentials. It does not store any personal information about the user. All it stores is where am I from, what's my institution, so that I can then direct the user to that IDP. That could be Athens, it could be Internet2, InCommon, Géant, SurfNet. It just stores what's your identity provider. And then some JavaScript that is centrally located that takes that browser-based storage and presents the user with a little button. And then I'll hopefully demo that, knock on wood. and then guidance to the publishing community and the service provider community about how to implement this so that there's a common user experience. So that common user experience, since this is the focus of the meeting, is built on several fairly simple building blocks. The first, as I mentioned, is a consistent call to action, a button that says, here, access through your institutional information. A smart search, which again, I'll be demoing this, hopefully. So how do you simply go in and say, I am at Oxford, I am at Cambridge or LC. And then the next time that user goes to access content by a RA21 compliant service, instead of being presented with access through your institution, it will say access through LC. So it'll make more sense to the user how they log in. So I am going to go out on a limb here and see if we can make this happen. So this is a prototype. It's still a work in progress. I found out yesterday that the developers were doing some back-end tweaking of the system. So fingers crossed, walk with me gently. So a user goes in, they search Google Scholar, they search PubMed, whatever their discovery service of choice is, they find a link. They're presented with some opportunity to get to content. Now the system has no idea where I'm from or how to get there. So I'm going to click on the first link here. That's an Elsevier article. So I'm brought to the Elsevier. This is a landing page. I'm not authenticated. So, oh, wait. You'll see here it says access through your institution. Again, we're still working on the UX and what the button will actually look like. There's also a notion of if you have multiple institutional affiliations. So I'm going to click here, access through the institution. So what's my institution? Oh, I'm at London. And then this is a smart search, again, based on EduGain metadata, which is collected by the identity federations. And each of these will take you directly to, say, the Geological Society of London.
You've lost a user already. Half of them don't even know the name of the institution.
You wouldn't know you're at...
Yeah, I'm quite serious.
At Oxford or whatever your university is?
When you're in the National Health Service and you've got several trusts next to each other with similar names, it's amazing how easily they get confused.
Well,
I have this problem every day.
I like to think that users know who their employer is.
Well, no,
or their...
actually, when you've got trusts called University Hospitals Coventry and Warwickshire NHS Trust, and you've got Coventry Partnership NHS Trust, they get very confused between the two of them.
Fine.
Yeah, we're talking, we're talking.
There is certainly user education that needs to take place here, right? But this is as simple as we can make it. Pick your institution. What is your institution? I don't have login credentials for, say, NHS, but I do have, thanks to Athens, have an RA21 test IDP. And this is where a user would log in with their institutional credentials. And let's see if I can remember what they are. RA21. Let's see if that works. Passwords.
Rebranding or where are you from? Need wafers.
So once I've logged in, I'm then taken back to the Elsevier page, and there's a button here, which unfortunately that lost its color, but it says access provided by RA21 IDP, right? And then if I go to the next, once you've identified yourself to the system, right, you do that once. You do that only once, and then the next time you return to, say, a ProQuest article, you're taken to access provided by RA21. So the only time you need to identify where the institution you're from is the first time, and then the next time and every subsequent time you're presented with a login information, the button doesn't say access through your institution. It says access through RA21 or access through LSE or Cambridge. So we can't get away entirely from the WAF problem, but this gets us a good direction in that, because the user only has to go through that WAF process once, and the browser stores that information in local browser storage. So, didn't work as well as I'd hoped, but
If you're using Google Scholar, there's an easier way of doing it than that?
well, sure, there is the CASA project. However, if you have questions and concerns about the publishing industry and their use of data, why do you think Google exists? They track everything. So would you want to store data with Google? If you care about privacy at all, you wouldn't use CASA, because you're then giving all of the access information and you're running all of the access systems through Google. So there's a toss-up there, and that's an option. But if you are concerned about RA21 from a perspective of privacy, I wouldn't turn to Google as the solution.
I wasn't meaning that.
So where does this project stand? I know I understand I've got one more minute. So we are just about ready to publish the recommendation. The draft for public comment I was hoping would be out by now. We had a conversation yesterday. Ideally, that draft will be out for public comment next week. We're also in the process of developing a governance structure to manage this, as well as pursue additional UX to run the JavaScript, as well as the further work about the consent workflow for individual consent of attribute release, which is something that the system will need. We'll start rolling this out in the second half of 2019. We'll stand up the service, and then publishers ideally will start adopting the RA21 recommendations. So if you want more information, it's ra21.org. There's a list of presentations there, more information about the privacy policies, et cetera, security. If you want to contact the leadership, that's Julia Wallace or Heather Flanagan. They're the project managers in this effort. And if you want, feel free, I'll be here the rest of the day. Feel free to speak with me if you want any more details. All right.